more widely known to us as a regular nationally syndicated columnist with the Washington Post and a former top policy advisor to the Bush II administration. And we'll hear more about that. Most interesting, maybe in this context, he was a theology major at Wheaton College. And he almost went to seminary. Now, it would have been the wrong one. It was on the other coast, but we'll forgive him for that possibility. God put his heavy hand on him in the form of Chuck Colson. So you don't know what's going to happen when you study theology and where you will land. But Michael is one of the most thoughtful, faithful Christian public intellectuals of our time. To be able to speak into the issues of our times from a vantage point of deep and abiding faith in Jesus. It comes through in everything he does and says, so we're really privileged to have Michael. We'll have some more things to say and give him more of an opportunity to speak about these wider contextual issues, but he's here to preach the word with us this morning.
Good afternoon. It really is a pleasure to be here at Gordon-Conwell. I do have to apologize. I was just mistakenly in the women's room. Some of you found out. I was not testing any gender identity issues. It was just a pure mistake, which I'm sorry for. It's like some horrible nightmare. But there is something a little strange about having a political columnist speak at chapel. It's probably overused, but it is like a lion in a den of Daniels. If I violate any conventions here, consider this your trigger warning. I have no intentions of talking about campaign politics today. For someone in my profession, it is easy to become obsessed. When I'm at home around the dinner table, my wife has started truly imposing a $20 fine every time I say the word Trump. And she is profiting nicely. Few of you may have vaguely recognized me. The most common thing I hear in airports after I've made an appearance on Meet the Press or the PBS NewsHour is, oh, you're that guy who's not David Brooks. I didn't really take the typical Washington path, as was mentioned. I was a Bible and theology major at Wheaton College in Illinois. As most of you know, it's a pretty religiously conservative place. The joke on campus when I went there was that the administration had banned premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. Out of college, I went to work at Prison Fellowship Ministries for Chuck Colson, who will be remembered, I think, as one of the great social reformers of the 20th century. How we treat prisoners, some of the most despised people in our society, is a test of our commitment to human dignity. And the former prisoners I met working at Prison Fellowship will always be my greatest examples of the transforming power of Christ, people more mature in their faith than I could ever hope to be. But my driving interest was political. I spent some time as a speechwriter and policy advisor on Capitol Hill. I spent some time in political journalism. Then I got a call from then Governor George Bush of Texas, who wanted to meet me at a Washington, D.C. hotel. The first thing he said was, this isn't an interview. I've read your stuff. I want you to write my announcement speech, my convention speech, and my inaugural address. And I want you to move to Austin immediately. At that point, he was not even a declared candidate for president, but he had an infectious confidence. And so I packed up my family and went. From the beginning, we were a little bit of an odd couple. He's outgoing, social, athletic, likable, and I'm actually none of those things. He has a penchant for locker room humor that makes me uncomfortable. I remember after one policy session at the governor's mansion in Austin, everyone had gone but me, and the governor had some time before his next appointment. He asked me, do you want to hang out a little while? With a rudeness that now seems crazed, I replied, not really. Which was true, and which is not the way to treat a future president. But I came to respect him as a politician and as a person. This may be controversial, but he is a man without a mask. Interest, frustration, boredom, sadness come unfiltered to his face. He's kind and loyal to the people around him, and he can occasionally be sharp-tongued. Every year on the day of the State of the Union address, the president sat down with all the network anchors for a time of question and answer. At one of those sessions, the late Peter Jennings asked him, "What does it feel like to go before the nation and read someone else's words?" The president immediately replied, "You do it every night." My life changed direction on September 11th, 2001, like the lives of many people. I was working at home. The president was in Florida. When my deputy, who was watching events in New York, said I should come in immediately, I was headed into work on a clear morning down Interstate 395 when I saw a plane flying low over the highway, headed toward the Pentagon, so low I could see the windows. Days later, I sat in the National Cathedral for the memorial service. I remember the solemn moment when all of official Washington stood and sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And I saw how in a few historical moments, the words, the rhetoric, I think can really matter to the country. The president said, quote, "This world he created is of moral design. Grief and tragedy and hatred are only for a time. Goodness, remembrance, and love have no end. And the Lord of life holds all who die and all who mourn." The pace of those White House years, including 9/11, war, natural disaster, was at times exhausting. It has a cost to your health. In December of 2004, while working on the president's second inaugural address, I had a heart attack. The president's doctor had me checked into the hospital under an assumed name to avoid all the press calls. Adding insult to incapacity, there wasn't a single call. And it has a cost to your family. During the heat of the 2004 presidential election, my little boy, Nicholas, who was then 6 years old, announced to me in the car that he wanted John Kerry for president. When I asked him why, he said, "So you can be home on weekends." My 9-year-old, who was a little more practical, then said, "But how would we eat?" That's true. I told him I think I could get a job, I might go to a think tank, and he said, of course, "What is a think tank?" So I told him, well, it's people who read and speak and have meetings and things. And Bucky, and this is true, said, "You mean they don't do anything?" That's not true of CPJ, by the way. After the 2004 election, my job at the White House changed. I became a policy advisor focused on global health, development, conflict issues, genocide, areas where my interests had been leading me for many years. And I saw something rather hopeful. In one of the most bitter times of partisanship in modern history, I also found a number of issues where members of both parties and people of every ideology have come together. As part of my job at the White House, I worked with conservative and liberal groups on the issue of global AIDS and confronting malaria and opposing global sex trafficking and confronting the crisis in Darfur and other places. I've seen some odd alliances grow. I've gotten to know Bono of U2 a bit. Several years ago, he invited me to the first rock concert I had ever attended, and it was loud. Soon afterwards, my wife and I had dinner with Bono, who is a very idealistic and principled man. After dinner, my wife told me, "You may be idealistic and principled, but it would also be nice if you were rich and cool." As head of speechwriting, I had an office in the West Wing. Back then, there was a TV show by the same name in which Rob Lowe, who some considered a handsome guy, played the character who held my job. We even met a few times. I remember my wife Dawn telling people at parties with great disappointment and regret in her voice, "Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental." I've also met Angelina Jolie. My wife was there too, I think. Or so she tells me. Now I'm a columnist for the Washington Post. Often fill in for my friend David Brooks on the NewsHour when he's out of town. I'm also a fellow at the One campaign founded by Bono. It's an organization that provides a political voice for the sick and suffering of the world. And I'm a fellow at the Center for Public Justice, about which I'll mention more later. When I remember my college years, I remember my roommates, Scott Baker, who I still talk to almost every day, and Jordan, who was the king of campus. He was class president. He knew the name of everyone on campus. I knew the name of just about no one, but Jordan and I got along. After we graduated in 1986, Jordan stayed in Chicago. I went to Washington, D.C. We talked by phone once or twice a week. He started law school in Tennessee. We talked less and less until my calls went unanswered. I thought he was busy, had a new life and new friends. Years went by. Then I learned from Scott that Jordan had AIDS. We went to see him in the hospital in Florida, shockingly thin, beset by infections. It was only a few years before the development of miracle drugs that could have saved him, but he died in 1994 at the age of 30. America at the time was in the midst of a national debate. A leading Christian pastor said, AIDS is God's judgment on a society that does not live by his rules. A majority of evangelicals in polls shared that belief. People with AIDS often died exposed, blamed, and stigmatized. I remember thinking at the time, why God's judgment for this and not for pride or spiritual arrogance or cruelty? Why do some human failures gain a special category of shame while others are conveniently minimized? And in fact, a principle became clear to me. There is nothing that more vividly and directly reveals our image of God, our conception of God, than our reaction to human suffering. So today I want to outline just a few Christian responses to suffering and how they determine our witness in the world. The first reaction is judgment. Following the attacks of September 11th, 2001, the immediate response of some Christian pastors was remarkable. Two prominent leaders blamed abortionists, feminists, gays and lesbians, and the ACLU for America's deserved punishment on 9/11. Following the Haitian earthquake, I remember, one leader blamed some historical Haitian pact with the devil for the deaths of tens of thousands of women and children. These examples may sound absurd, but this general attitude is more common among evangelicals than we imagine or admit. Without denying that God is ultimately in charge of history, it is necessary to assert that such interpretations of tragic events are offensive and theologically unsound. It is not immediately evident why religious leaders should have special prophetic insights into God's purposes in history, or why the failures that especially offend them should count more than sins such as pride, social injustice, and indifference to the poor, or why the family of a 9/11 victim should blame the ACLU rather than Al-Qaeda. A simplistic conception of divine providence, the punishment of individuals for the sake of corporate offenses, makes a mockery of individual moral agency and opens Christian leaders to charges of monstrous indifference to tragedy. Every nation, like every life, is a mixture of ruin and nobility. The theologian Richard Mouw put it this way: the antithesis between godliness and ungodliness is very real, but it is discernible not only in the larger patterns of culture, but also in the inner battlegrounds of our own souls. In Christian belief, God's ultimate goal is to bring men and women into communion with himself. His dealings with the world serve that purpose, and God's purpose can be advanced through redemptive suffering, which is not a punishment, but a mystery and a method of grace. The workings of God in the midst of tragedy cannot be reduced to a simplistic moral mathematics in which sin equals disaster. Believers share the blessings and tragedies and diseases of their neighbors and should work and pray for the good of others, not declare the suffering of their neighbors to be something deserved. Second, more hopeful response to suffering is compassion. While a few, for example, blamed Haiti for their own earthquake, many rushed to help the victims. This represents not only a different view of those who suffer, but a different view of God, the image that we see in Jesus. The relief of suffering was essentially related to the announcement of his kingdom. And the healing of disease played an important symbolic role. It previewed the greater healing of all creation, the end of blindness, the end of mental anguish, the end of affliction such as leprosy that marked men and women as outcasts. Christ's healing ministry was a protest against the random cruelties of this world and the promise of a better world to come. Some historians credit in part the rapid expansion of Christianity in the Roman Empire to the willingness of Christians to serve their neighbors in times of plague, to enter the houses of the sick when no one else would. It is the proper way to serve a God of mercy and to make him known to others. And I have seen this kind of witness in many places, from inner cities to the developing world, particularly in the response to HIV/AIDS. I've met nuns in Ethiopia who care for HIV-positive orphans, and a pastor in South Africa who promotes AIDS prevention among sex workers, and a pastor's wife in Zambia who delivers patients to the hospital by bicycle, and a nurse in Uganda who began paying for AIDS drugs of patients with her own money. By worldly standards, these are buried lives in remote places. They are actually some of the most powerful representatives of God on earth. In these places, the kingdom of God is arriving day by day. The third Christian response to suffering is justice, which is the responsibility of a community, the work of citizens, not individuals. And here I'll give a little more focus. Over the last few decades, Christian involvement in politics has gotten a bad name, some of it deserved. The religious right led Christians back into the public square after a long absence, a good and positive thing, but sometimes left the public square littered with anger and rhetorical excess. The movement began as a reaction against the aggressions of the modern world. It ended by squandering much of its promise because it was too reactive. Often it reacted to anger with anger. It reacted against the liberal social gospel by downplaying the very idea of social justice, thus narrowing the range of evangelical concern. The result was often a partial agenda, even a partisan one. The wrong kind of politics can not only compromise an individual believer, but undermine the message of the church itself. Any political movement, particularly a virtuous political movement, can become a consuming substitute for faith. And the line is fine between zeal and anger. In the epilogue to A Severe Mercy, Sheldon Vannikin writes, "I was one of those caught up in the mood and action of the 1960s. Christ, I thought, would surely have me oppose what appeared to be an unjust war. But the movement, whatever its ideals, did a good deal of hating. And Christ gradually was pushed to the rear. Movement goals, not God, became first. I now think that making God secondary, which is in the end is making him nothing, is quite simply the mortal danger in social action. Some may avoid this danger, perhaps, but I was not obeying the first and greatest commandment, to love God first, nor is it clear that I was obeying the second, to love my neighbor. Hating the oppressors of my neighbor isn't perhaps quite what Christ had in mind." The same story can be told again and again on left and right. Instead of providing an independent voice, instead of being the steadfast representatives of another kingdom, Christians merely baptize someone else's agenda. They are reduced to a tool in the power game of others. And as Father Richard Newhouse once bluntly told me, the church as a tool is a church of fools. In every generation, some believers conclude that political engagement is not worth the risk and the inevitable cost. We hear those voices again. It is argued in some Christian circles that culture is upstream from politics, that songs and scholarship, movies and technological innovation, novels and newspapers ultimately determine nation's shape, not primarily its laws. And there is truth in this point. Politics usually involves one form of power, coercion, either through the demands of law or the demands of taxation. But there are other forms of power in a society: the power of beauty and myth, the power of ideals and academic excellence, the power of example and integrity. So perhaps Christians should focus more on cultural formation than political activism. Perhaps they should be content with demonstrating the values of the city of God instead of writing statutes for the city of man. The problem is this: culture is upstream from politics, except in those important cases when politics is upstream from culture. In April of 1963, a group of 8 Birmingham clergy members made a famous argument about the limits and dangers of political activism. Writing in the Birmingham News, they criticized civil rights activism as, quote, unwise and untimely, and urged believers to show patience. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., then in the Birmingham City Jail, began writing a response in the margins of a newspaper. King's argument was simple and damning. Patience for political injustice comes easier for those who are not currently experiencing injustice. Perhaps it is easy, he said, for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen the vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro living consistently at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. End quote. All of the cautions about a politicized faith are true. Thinkers such as Reinhold Niebuhr were correct to urge realism about the world, humility in making grand moral claims, and suspicion about our own political motives. But people of faith, particularly younger people, should internalize King's prison letter before accepting Niebuhr's corrective. A distrust of political action would have left legal segregation in place. Changing a culture of bigotry required both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, coercive measures that created a social expectation of equal treatment and shifted the political balance of power in America. And none of this would have happened without idealism, impatience, and the single-minded pursuit of justice. At any given moment in a democracy, great issues of justice and morality are at stake. The idea that people of faith can take a sabbatical from politics, lick their wounds, is a form of irresponsibility. It is, in fact, an argument that could only be made by comfortable Christians. If one lived in a neighborhood plagued by poverty, dominated by gangs, and served by failing schools, there is no sabbatical from the failures of politics. Getting drug dealers off the corner and teaching children the basics of reading and math are at least as important as long-term cultural change, and certainly more urgent. If one lived in a foreign country without medicines for AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, or dominated by a cruel dictator, the current policy priorities of the American people and its government would matter greatly to you. Retreating from the cause of justice, even temporarily, is only conceivable for those who have few needs of justice themselves. The alternative to doing politics badly is doing politics better, not turning against the political process itself. The focus of our political engagement will naturally vary by interest and background, but the primary shared Christian political commitment, the value and dignity of every human life, is challenged at home and across the world by family breakdown and racism and corruption and slavery and preventable disease and wasteful conflict. We cannot praise the examples of Wilberforce and Bonhoeffer and Niemöller and remain blind to the challenges of our time. Christianity is not defined by a political ideology, but it requires an unavoidably political question. What if every human being we meet and every prisoner in a maximum security cell, and every unwed mother, and every hungry child in a distant land, and everyone with a severe disability, and everyone we love, and everyone we hate, is actually the reflected image of their Creator, the most precious thing we will ever touch or see in this life. When I first came to Washington and was looking for models of social engagement, bodies of thought that attempted to answer the question I just raised, I found inspiration in two traditions. The tradition of Catholic social thought, with its emphasis on subsidiarity and solidarity, and the Reformed tradition of sphere sovereignty and principled pluralism. Both are attempts to define the common good, which is not identical to market forces, which themselves can be dehumanizing in the absence of moral commitments. The common good is not identical to state action, which can actually undermine communities with unintended consequences. And the common good is not identical to individual autonomy and choice, which sounds like freedom, but can be a prison of excess or an excuse to exploit others. Rather, the common good is that set of social circumstances that allow everyone to flourish and be valued and have dignity. The great contribution of Catholic and Reformed thought has been the root of individual good and the justice of society is found in the health of a realm that stands between the two, the health of families and religious institutions that pass character between generations, and charities and community institutions that build habits of cooperation and care for the spirit. Strengthening and defending this important realm between the individual and the state, and pursuing public policies that honor this role, has been the work of the Center for Public Justice for many decades, and is a framework of a little book that we put together called Unleashing Opportunity. We set out to find some achievable goals in pursuing the common good on juvenile justice and payday lending and foster care and reform and other topics where progress is possible and bipartisan ideological coalitions are present. In a limited way, I've seen what politics can accomplish. My best experience in government was this. I sat in the Oval Office and watched President Bush make the decision to approve the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, the largest initiative to fight a single disease in human history. And I've seen the results. Until, say, 12 years ago, in that orphanage in Ethiopia I mentioned earlier in my speech, the sisters could only hold the hands of the children as they died. Not a single one survived. Some of the infants were blinded by infections. Some of them, I was told, asked the sisters, "Why can't you come with me where I'm going? Why do I have to go alone?" But then the AIDS drugs began arriving. Now almost no children are dying at that orphanage. I saw infants who had their sight restored. I met children who had come back from the brink of death like Lazarus. It is the closest thing I have ever come to seeing the wonders of the New Testament. More than 13 million Africans are now on the AIDS treatment that came too late for my friend. Americans should know about this achievement and be proud of it. And Christians should be the strongest base of support for works of healing and mercy of this type. When it comes to politics, people of faith are left with an unavoidable tension, a necessary complexity. There is a danger of politicized faith, but politics is not a necessary evil. It is the calling and context that allows other people to flourish. It creates the moral context for a culture, defining the boundaries of a community and the duties that we owe to one another. Politics is the realm of necessity. It can also be the realm of nobility. At its best, it is about the right ordering of our lives together. It cannot be unimportant because justice is never unimportant. Political rhetoric and ideals can raise the moral sights of a nation and point men and women to responsibilities beyond the narrow bounds of self and family. Creative policy can serve the common good in a local school or on the other side of the world. There's a lot of cynicism about politics today. But I stand on the side of John Buchan. Public life, he said, is regarded as the crown of a career, and to young men it is the worthiest ambition. Politics is still the greatest and most honorable adventure. This has been my experience, and I think other men and women will find it so. Thank you.